Did you know that the queen is actually kind of crazy? I mean, not like all the time, but for most of what should have happened in episode 21, she really made it seem that way. And honestly, after you see what the anime had left out, her borderline unstable attitude is actually kind of justified. Yeah, sure, the trial as we saw in the anime was quite satisfying, but some of the things that the queen and Naofumi came up with as potential punishments for Mine and the king were borderline sadistic, in ways that for a second I thought I was reading Overlord. So let's see what this queen is really like as we go through all the events that was skipped from episode 21. Let's begin. Episode 21, Naofumi's Triumphant Return, covering chapter 11 from volume 4 of the light novel and chapter 30 to 32 from the manga. 2 days had gone by since Naofumi passed out after the battle. He was carried to a specialized treatment facility located in a town near the castle. You see, aside from his physical wounds, Naofumi was cursed by the blood sacrifice, and no amount of medicine or magic could heal him. Naofumi opened his stats to check what was up, and it showed that all of his attributes other than defense had dropped by 30%. The only way to recover those lost stats was to make a full recovery, which the doctors estimated would take about a month. This meant that he wouldn't be in his best shape once the next wave came around, something that Naofumi wasn't very fond of. The queen then entered the room, and although she was hiding her face behind her fan, she was quite visibly angry, furious even, with all this anger pointed towards Mine and the king for doing what they did while she was away. So much so that Malty says she saw her tearing up their portraits and burning them to ash. The queen even had her shadows carry around extra portraits just so that she could use them as target practice whenever she felt the need to express her anger. But that wasn't enough to sate her rage. It was like the betrayal of her own family had made her unstable. Then, in a way that seemed borderline deranged, she told Naofumi that she wanted to see their faces twisted in fear. It was clear she was harboring some very intense emotions, which also made it apparent that she was only telling the truth. Because of this, he decides that he could trust her for now, and by her request, proceeds to accompany her back to the castle. Upon entering the throne room, both Mine and the king were there. At first, the king was shocked to see the queen with the shield hero, finding it so unbelievable that he even attempted to convince the soldiers that she was an imposter. Let's just say that that comment didn't pass by the queen very well. She imprisoned the king in ice, then walked over and slapped him across the face several times, all while scolding him for not listening to her orders while she was away, stating how she trusted him to take care of the kingdom in her absence. Yet, during these crucial times of world crisis, he put his own selfish desires ahead of the country's. Every time the king would try to get a word in, she'd just slap him again, not wanting to hear any excuses. Now, you may think that this was a bit excessive based on how the queen was portrayed in the anime, but we're actually just getting started. The queen focused her attention towards Mine next. Mine tried to convince her mother that Naofumi did what he was accused of. The thing is, even if he did, the queen didn't seem to care. She was already aware that Mine had been doing it with Motoyasu, so she didn't see why it mattered if it was with Naofumi. In fact, the queen actually said that if Mine did in fact have some sort of relationship with the shield hero, then she probably could have saved her from her current situation. When Naofumi heard this, he could only cringe at the thought. The queen then goes on to say that at least there was still hope for Malty, referring to the fact that because Malty and Naofumi were close acquaintances, they could still potentially end up in a relationship together. Now, everyone including Naofumi was a bit confused by the statement, cause Malty was still just this little girl, and Naofumi really didn't want to be known as the guy with the lolly complex. But after thinking about it, the queen's statement did start to make a bit more sense. Remember, Siltbelt was an enemy to Melremark, but they also worshipped the shield hero. So if the royal line of Melremark adopted Naofumi into its lineage through, say, a marriage with Malty, Melremark would then become this holy country in the eyes of Siltbelt, meaning the whole marriage would be this political move to improve relations between the two nations, and hopefully eventually bring the two together as allies. Of course, Malty had no intentions of being used as a political pawn, so with a red face, she quickly said no to all of her mother's requests. Knowing that Malty was just being shy, her mother simply tells her that she just needs to try her best. Malty also couldn't help but feel a little dejected when Naofumi further dismissed her mother's statements as absurd. This eased a bit of the tension in the room because at least the other heroes now knew that Naofumi wasn't a total creep. However, the queen seemed rather insistent on Malty bearing Naofumi's child, in a way that seemed as if she wouldn't let him return to Earth unless he did. But that may just have been Naofumi jumping to conclusions. The Queen then continues to berate Mine, stating how she knows all about her nasty habits of taking advantage of others, also demanding to know the truth of the entire situation. But Mine showed no signs of admitting to her lies, so the Queen had no choice but to bring out the tools to administer a slave seal. Meanwhile, Motoyasu was growing restless as he watched this person he trusted so much be held down on the ground and put through this pain. He raised his spear as if he was about to prep an attack, but Naofumi casted Shield Prison, and he kept him inside of it until the skill timed out, giving the royal guard enough time to implant the seal. Now, this slave seal was slightly different. It's a more powerful iteration of the one that Raphtalia has. Rather than staying as a permanent mark on the skin, it'll disappear when not in use and only reappear when it's punishing the host. So when the first question was asked, Mine tried to lie, saying that everything that Naofumi did was true. This caused the seal to appear and activate itself, inflicting intense bits of pain to Mine. Only after admitting the truth did the seal disappear again. Motoyasu, still being the idiot he is, believed that this method was just to force words out of Mine's mouth. He didn't think that any of what she was saying was the truth. That's why, in order to make sure that no one would have any misconceptions regarding the outcome of this trial, Mine was temporarily registered as Motoyasu's slave. It made the information regarding how slave seals work appear in his built-in HUD, allowing him to understand that what was happening was in fact the truth. Everything from the forest fires to her plot to remove Malty from the line of succession was revealed to the people. And slowly but surely, Naofumi's name was being cleared. But even with all this evidence, Motoyasu still refused to believe it. He even continued to blame Naofumi, but that's either how faithful he is to his friends or just how dense he is. The king's trial came next, but he didn't really have much to say other than that everything was the shield hero's fault, which didn't really matter anyway since the queen had already heard enough. Now, throughout the entire trial, Naofumi was growing anxious. Neither Mine nor the king were going to apologize. And though that was frustrating to him, what was more frustrating was being in the same room as them. Even being in the castle in general was an overall sour experience. He just didn't want to be there. Things did become a bit more entertaining though when the queen finally delivered her verdict. She first disowned them from their royal status, stating how they were both unfit to have such power, following it up by giving context to the gravity of their actions. You see, every nation was suffering heavy losses from the waves, so the kings and queens of each of them agreed to a single meeting to discuss this crisis, leading to the decision that each major nation would agree to set aside their differences and summon one hero at a time, with Melromark being the last. But by the time they had come to that agreement, Melromark had already summoned all of the heroes for themselves, and of course every other nation wasn't very happy about that. It resulted in the poor diplomatic relations that we see today. This made the other heroes question why the queen would leave such an irresponsible person in charge of an entire country. But we find out that the king wasn't her first choice. She actually had someone that she trusted as her right hand, pretty much what we would know as the hand of the queen. And it was this person who was supposed to take care of the kingdom in her absence. Now, the reason this person was so trusted by the queen was because his values aligned very closely with hers. He was a noble who spent a lot of time earning the trust of the demi-humans. But when the first wave hit, he gave his life protecting them. You see, this noble was committed to a larger plan to improve relations between Melromark and Siltveld. If Melromark showed that they were trying to create equality between humans and demi-humans, then Siltveld would likely do the same. And for a while, it actually worked. At least until this noble died and everything fell apart. Because that noble wasn't there anymore, the king even went and ordered the demolition of an entire demi-human district that was supposed to be protected by Melromark. And yeah, that was Raphtalia's district. Meaning Raphtalia's entire tragic backstory was a direct result of the king's orders. Now, the queen just couldn't believe that despite her true enemy being the church, that the king did almost the same amount of damage. She slapped the king for every wrong action she could list, and it seemed like that list went on forever. Why the queen seemed so unstable began to make more sense. Naofumi even began to sympathize with her. I mean, everyone she had trusted had either died or was not so trustworthy to begin with. This meant that she now had to carry the entire country's weight and all of its problems by herself. The next declaration the queen made was that the Church of the Three Heroes was now a heretical religion, and the only religion that Melromark would now follow was the Church of the Four Holy Heroes. which was one that actually already existed, but not followed due to the Three Heroes Church being so deeply rooted into the foundation of Melromarc's creation. As it would turn out, this religion had put a lot of funding towards forming Melromarc into the kingdom that we see today, thus why it had so much influence. Now, the queen wasn't done there. There was still much more punishment to dole out. She proceeds to hand Mine a piece of paper, which we soon find out to be a bill of all the money that Mine owed the kingdom. It would seem that during her mother's absence, Mine had assumed that all of the kingdom's assets were hers for the taking. This included anything and everything from guild resources to treasures, and the bill accounted for all of it, even including the cost of burning down the forest. So let's just say that the total amount was extravagant, bringing us now to Mine's second sentencing. In order to pay all of this back, she would have to work as a slave until she was no longer in debt. And if she didn't want to work as a slave, then she'd have to contribute to the country some other way. This meant joining the heroes to fight the waves on the front lines. And that didn't only apply to Mine. The king also either had to join the front lines or abandon all responsibilities and become an adventurer. Both didn't seem to like the idea since they both immediately began to beg for forgiveness, something that the queen was definitely short of right now. She then comes up with an idea, and gives Naofumi the right to decide their next punishment. Mine scurried to Naofumi's feet and began to beg. But when she said his name, she made a grave mistake and mispronounced it, which really triggered Naofumi, and I mean really made him angry. So the only thing that came to his mind after that was the death penalty. He didn't even think about it. He subconsciously hated these two so much that it was almost like a natural response. It's because deep down, he knew that death would be the only way to erase all the hatred that he bears. Even the queen, Ren and Itsuki, agreed that this punishment was a fitting one, especially given how much they had screwed over Melromarc at an international level. But simply executing them was too plain of a death for the queen. She wanted to give them hope, make them feel that they had secured their freedom, then torture and execute them after. Or maybe give them simple jobs and keep them around until they work themselves to death. Naofumi and the queen seemed to really like this idea of having them as pets and domesticating them to death. Though, considering that she was putting so much thought into such gruesome ways of disposing her own family members, Naofumi couldn't help but think that maybe it was the queen who was the darkest person in the country. In actuality, these were just suggestions, simply words that embodied the emotions that she was feeling at that time. She didn't actually want them to die. It was only to show Naofumi that he could literally ask for anything and the queen would follow through with it. Naofumi then recommended a crucifixion. That way their deaths would send a powerful message to anyone who would try to oppose them in the future. Normally, the queen would have agreed, but crucifying the king wouldn't go well with the other nations. You see, despite how he currently is, in the past, many of his deeds as the kingdom's strategist gained him recognition all over the world. And to this day, many people still respect him. So much so that if they were to kill him in such a public manner like that, then that could go as far as to start a war. Naofumi got the point. The king was too famous to kill. He recalled Malty's stories of him having proven himself time and time again in battle as a master strategist. So it made sense why he had so many allies and why killing him wasn't the best course of action. So instead, Naofumi suggested making them suffer. Perhaps ripping off their hands and feet would be a good start. This only made Mine grovel at his feet some more. She was crying non-stop and could barely muster out any words. When she finally did though, she made such a hypocritical statement that everyone in the room could do nothing but just look on in shock. She had begged Naofumi to not do anything as foolish as look for revenge, stating how revenge only breeds further revenge. Now, the fact that she could even say something like that given the situation that she was in just absolutely floored Naofumi. It's what spurred the idea for their final punishment. Mine would have to become an adventurer and have her name changed to Whore. Likewise, the king would be known as Trash and have to become a soldier. So, to ensure that they understood their new non-royal positions, the queen forced them to their knees so that Naofumi's next request could be met. It was an old one that he had put forth back at the end of the third wave. Remember when he demanded that the king crawl on his knees? Well, that's what Naofumi wanted, and that's what he got. Shadows and knights surrounded both Whore and Trash, and forced them to their knees with their heads touching the ground. This was what Naofumi wanted to see. He felt great, especially since they seemed to be in so much anguish just kneeling down like that. It was as if this one act was the most humiliating thing that they'd ever done in their entire lives. For whatever reason, they just couldn't swallow their pride and humbly apologize. They began to struggle and scream with all their might. I mean, it looked as if it brought them so much discomfort that it made Ren and Itsuki wonder if Naofumi was going too far. Their state of panic was just so unsightly that no one really wanted to look at it. Naofumi was the only one that seemed to be enjoying it. Even Malty and Raftalia seemed to be disappointed by Naofumi's actions. Naofumi didn't really care though. He enjoyed the show while it lasted, and after that was finished, everyone except for the Queen and Naofumi's party were escorted out of the throne room. The Queen still had stuff that she wanted to discuss, information that needed to be shared as well as stuff that she wanted to find out. First was an explanation as to why everything turned out the way it did. It all comes back to Siltfelt and Melremark. These two are like water and oil, complete opposites. Melremark, a mainly human society, has demi-human slaves and follows the Church of the Three Heroes. On the other hand, Siltfelt is a demi-human society with human slaves and they follow the Church of the Shield. Both religions diverged from the original Church of the Four Heroes. And it was this difference in faith along with some built-in discrimination that led to the ongoing conflicts between the two nations. It essentially meant that Naofumi was summoned right into enemy territory. I mean, it made sense why the king hated him now. He was the saint of Melremark's rival nation, and because the king must have fought countless wars against them, it's no wonder he despised their most iconic figure. Naofumi even bet that to the knowledgeable people of Melremark, the shield hero was probably taught to be seen as a demon. And it's likely that the king wanted to make it so that the entire nation saw it that way. As for why the king or the church just didn't kill Naofumi right away, well, apparently they were waiting for the other heroes to do it on their own accord. But they had to wait until the other heroes became strong enough to do so. However, by that point, the church began doubting their abilities to maintain control, which led to the mess of events from the last few episodes. That whole time though, the Queen was busy with international negotiations trying to avert going to war with literally everyone. It was only after this that she could return home. Of course, it wasn't the greatest news since the priest had come into possession of the legendary weapon replica. Naofumi was told that they were lucky that the replica only carried a quarter of the power of the originals. This meant that all the heroes could become 4 times stronger than how the priest was. They just needed enough time. Finally, the Queen gets to asking if Naofumi will still support her nation. As much as Naofumi wanted to say goodbye and leave, he couldn't bring himself to it because of his promise to Vittoria. The Queen did know that Naofumi was hesitant, so she decides to tell him what will happen if he goes to Siltfelt. First, the princesses will demand an audience. Then, the female demi-humans will make a harem around him. Now, as unlikely as this will sound, Naofumi was turned off by the idea. Not because it didn't seem like a good time, but because he still wouldn't be able to trust any woman that easily. Especially those who would try to control or take advantage of him. That was something that he was trying to avoid. The second thing that would happen would be that Siltfelt would literally give him anything that he wished for. Should he demand an invasion of Melremark, then all of them would gladly march to their deaths. But that aspect could be taken a bit too far. Siltfelt was already known as a rather extreme country, and it's because of this that Naofumi came to the conclusion that if he went, it would be either heaven or hell. Even so, that off chance it would be hell was still better than being here. The Queen saw that she had still not yet swayed Naofumi's mind, so as a final act of reverence, she kneeled down and bowed her head before him. Everyone including Philo recognized the significance of this action. Here we had the highest authority of all of Melremark, pleading on her knees for the shield hero to stay, going so far as to offer her own life and name if it meant soothing his anger. This just went to show that the entire future of Melremark relied solely on Naofumi. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, the Queen was merely a figurehead. Naofumi knew he had a bigger role to play, so he felt that this one time he could trust her. After all, her shadows did save him once before, and if he did continue to doubt everyone, then he wouldn't be able to move forward. He would never be able to keep Vittoria's promise. There was no reason to keep making enemies. Sure, he still had many, but if he could avoid them whenever possible, then that would be a good step in the right direction. So, it was with this decision that Naofumi had now made a powerful ally, and he began to think that perhaps things might start to get better. As he looked around the room at each of his companions, the friends he made on this long journey, he thought, no, things will get better. And that's that. Episode 21 with all of the gaps filled in. Not that there were very many, but I think it was good to show this kind of crazed side of the Queen that the anime left out. Personally, I think it would have done well to help develop her character a little bit more. I mean, it's not like they didn't have time either, considering that there were still 4 episodes remaining in the season. But it is what it is. Now you know for when Season 2 and 3 come out, which, if you haven't heard, has been confirmed to be in production. So that means much more cut content and perhaps finally some who is or how strong is videos. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!